San Quentin Prison, California death row that shook America. The prison rises out of the fog like it was never meant to be seen clearly. San Quentin has stood here for more than a century, watching California change while it stayed the same. Men have entered these gates knowing, with certainty, that they would never leave alive. Some waited months. Others waited decades. All of them listened to the same sounds every night. The echo of keys, the distant metal slam of doors, and the quiet question that never went away, will tomorrow be my last? And what happened inside these walls didn't just end lives. It reshaped laws, haunted families, and forced America to confront what it means to punish in the name of justice. What unfolded on San Quentin's death row is darker than most people realize, and the worst part isn't what you expect. A prison born to execute. San Quentin State Prison opened in 1852, making it California's oldest prison. From the beginning, it carried a singular purpose: containment, punishment, and finality. While other prisons evolved, San Quentin became the state center for execution. If California decided a man would die, this was where the sentence was carried out. Death row wasn't always a separate world. In its early years, condemned men were held among the general population, their fate known to everyone. The psychological cruelty of that arrangement was immense. Imagine sleeping beside men serving short sentences while knowing your own sentence had no release date, only an ending. Over time, the state isolated death row, not out of mercy, but control. Officials believed separation would reduce violence. What it really did was create a pressure cooker unlike anything else in the American prison system. And once that pressure was sealed, it never fully released. Entering death row. Arrival on death row followed a ritual that rarely changed. A man would be transferred from a county jail or another prison, usually after years of appeals. By the time he arrived, he already knew the routine. Strip search. Paperwork. Medical screening. Then the walk. That walk mattered. Guards led new arrivals down long corridors lined with cells stacked 5 tiers high. Condemned men watched silently from behind bars. No welcome. No threats. Just eyes. Everyone on death row remembered that moment, because it made one thing brutally clear: you had joined a population that did not plan for the future. Cells were small, often no more than 4 by 8 feet. A steel bunk. A thin mattress. A toilet sink combination bolted to the wall. No doors you could open yourself. Once the gate shut, it stayed shut. For many, that sound followed them into sleep for years. And the longer you stayed, the heavier it became. Daily life in a place without tomorrow. Death row mornings began early. Count. Breakfast trays slid through slots. More count. Time on death row wasn't measured in days or months, it was measured in routines that never changed. Most men spent 22 to 23 hours a day alone. Exercise, when allowed, happened in small concrete yards sometimes called dog runs. No grass. No equipment. Just walls and sky. Conversation happened through bars, across tiers, or by yelling down the corridor. Friendships formed slowly and cautiously. Trust was dangerous in a place where desperation lived everywhere. Some men read obsessively. Others worked on legal appeals, filing paperwork long after the odds turned against them. A few taught themselves art, filling notebooks with drawings they might never show anyone. The routine was meant to preserve order. But over time, it did something else. It erased the difference between weekdays and holidays, between years and decades. And for many, that erasure was more damaging than the sentence itself. The psychology of waiting. Death row wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was designed to wait. And waiting became its own punishment. Some men arrived believing execution would come within a few years. Instead, they watched their hair turn gray. They watched guards retire. They watched governors come and go. Psychologists later described a condition unique to long-term death row confinement, a mix of hyperawareness and emotional numbness. Men lived with constant awareness of death, yet were unable to emotionally prepare for it. Sleep was often broken by nightmares or the sound of keys at night. Even routine cell checks caused panic. Was this the night? The uncertainty did something brutal, it made hope dangerous. Hope meant pain. Acceptance meant surrender. And in the middle of that tension, San Quentin continued to carry out executions. The gas chamber. For decades, San Quentin's most infamous room was the gas chamber. Built in the 1930s, it looked clinical, almost ordinary. Inside, it delivered one of the most controversial forms of execution in American history. Condemned men were strapped to a chair. Cyanide pellets dropped into acid beneath them. Witnesses described violent coughing, convulsions, and visible panic. Executions that were supposed to be swift sometimes took agonizing minutes. Word traveled fast on death row. Men knew what waited for them. Some counted how many executions happened each year. Others avoided the topic entirely. Executions affected everyone, not just the condemned. Guards were required to participate. Medical staff observed. Chaplains prayed. Nobody left untouched. And over time, the gas chamber began to draw attention far beyond the prison walls. Public outrage and legal battles. By the 1960s and 70s, San Quentin had become a symbol in the national debate over capital punishment. Civil rights groups challenged the gas chamber as cruel and unusual. Families of victims demanded justice be carried out. Inside the prison, men watched these arguments play out through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Some believed change might come in time. Others believed it wouldn't matter. Legal challenges piled up. Executions slowed, then stopped altogether for periods. But death row kept growing. Men continued arriving, even when the state wasn't executing anyone. This created a new reality, a death sentence without a death date. And that uncertainty changed the balance of power inside the prison. Unwritten rules of survival. Death row had its own rules, unspoken but strictly followed. Violence existed, but it was rare compared to other maximum security units. Everyone understood the risk of punishment was too high. Respect mattered. Borrowing without permission could lead to consequences. Loud behavior at night was frowned upon, not because of courtesy, but survival. Sleep was precious. Race still shaped alliances, but less rigidly than in general population. Isolation forced cooperation. Information was currency, legal advice, news from outside, rumors about upcoming changes. Snitching was dangerous. So was pretending you had nothing to lose. Because even on death row, men found reasons to keep living. Execution nights. When executions resumed, death row felt it immediately. The night before an execution was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Conversations stopped early. Radios were turned low or off completely. On the night itself, men listened for sounds, extra footsteps, doors opening, a transport cart moving down the corridor. Some prayed. Some stared at the wall. Some cried silently. The condemned man was removed hours before execution. Once his cell door closed behind him for the last time, the entire tier felt empty. Afterward, word traveled back. It always did. And once it was over, the routine resumed. Breakfast trays still came. Counts still happened. The system did not pause to grieve. The switch to lethal injection. Legal pressure eventually forced California to abandon the gas chamber. Lethal injection was introduced as a more humane alternative. The chamber was redesigned. New protocols were written. But the change didn't bring closure. Instead, it opened a new chapter of controversy. Questions about drug combinations, staff training, and transparency sparked fresh lawsuits. Executions slowed again. Then stopped. By the early 2000s, San Quentin held the largest death row population in the Western Hemisphere. Hundreds of men sentenced to die, with no executions taking place. Death row had become something else entirely, a permanent limbo. Guards on death row. For officers, working death row was unlike any other assignment. They enforced rules among men who technically had nothing to lose, but emotionally had everything. Some officers kept strict distance. Others developed quiet professional relationships. Conversations stayed surface level. Boundaries were everything. Many officers reported carrying the weight home with them. They remembered faces. They remembered final meals. They remembered names. Few talked about it openly. And over time, the psychological toll mirrored that of the men they guarded. Families on the outside. Death row punishment extended beyond prison walls. Families traveled long distances for short visits. Conversations were monitored. Physical contact was limited or non-existent. Parents aged waiting for appeals. Children grew up knowing their father through glass and phone calls. Some families stopped coming, unable to endure the pain. Victims' families lived with a different kind of waiting, hoping for closure that never arrived. San Quentin held all of them in the same slow suspension of time. Mental illness and execution. Mental illness was widespread on death row. Some men arrived already unstable. Others deteriorated over time. Solitary confinement intensified paranoia, depression, and hallucinations. Courts wrestled with the question, can someone who no longer understands their punishment be executed? The debate dragged on, unresolved, while men continued to wait. And waiting remained the constant. The death penalty question. As years passed, San Quentin became less a place of execution and more a monument to contradiction. A prison built to kill now held men indefinitely. Justice delayed had become justice distorted. Governors imposed moratoriums. Courts issued stays. Public opinion shifted back and forth. But inside the walls, none of that changed daily life. Men still woke up in cells designed for the end. San Quentin's death row didn't just punish individuals. It tested the limits of punishment itself. It asked whether waiting for death could be worse than death itself. It forced a nation to confront the cost of certainty, revenge, and delay. For decades, these walls held men frozen in time, living in the shadow of an ending that never quite arrived. And the question San Quentin leaves behind is not whether the death penalty works. It's whether a society can carry this kind of waiting, and still call it justice. Because long after the execution stopped, the echo of that waiting still lingers inside these walls. The longest wait. For some men on San Quentin's death row, the wait stretched beyond imagination. 10 years became 20. 20 became 30. Sentences once described as death quietly transformed into something closer to lifelong isolation. Men began to joke darkly about outliving the prison itself. Others stopped talking about their cases altogether. Appeals paperwork gathered dust. Calendars stopped being marked. What replaced urgency was endurance. The punishment was no longer about the moment of death. It was about surviving a life designed to end. And the longer the wait lasted, the more uncomfortable the question became, what exactly was the sentence now? The silent execution of identity. Years on death row stripped away more than freedom. It eroded identity. Men entered with professions, families, beliefs. Over time, many became known only by their cell number. Without work assignments, without physical movement, without meaningful human contact, the sense of self faded. Some men stopped recognizing their own voices when they spoke. Others avoided mirrors altogether. Letters from home slowed, then stopped. Friends moved on. Parents died. Children grew up. The world continued without them. And inside San Quentin, that absence became its own form of execution. When hope becomes dangerous. Every appeal carried a risk. Winning meant reopening emotional wounds, reliving the crime, facing public attention again. Losing meant another door closed. Sometimes the last one. Some men stopped filing altogether, not because they believed they deserved to die, but because hope had become unbearable. Each denial carved something away. Others clung to the smallest technicality, the faintest legal argument, knowing it might buy another year. Hope, on death row, was not comforting. It was exhausting. The unseen punishments. Punishments on death row were subtle but severe. Loss of yard time. Confiscation of radios. Temporary isolation within isolation. Rules were enforced strictly, but often quietly. A missed count. A misunderstood order. A minor infraction could mean weeks without human interaction. There were no privileges to earn, only restrictions to avoid. The message was clear: compliance kept life manageable. Resistance made it unbearable. And most men learned quickly which choice allowed them to survive another day. When execution became uncertain. As legal battles mounted, executions grew rarer. Then they stopped altogether. Some men celebrated cautiously. Others distrusted the silence. Death row had taught them that certainty was an illusion. Was this a pause? Or the end? No one inside San Quentin could answer that question. Administrations changed. Policies shifted. But death sentences remained. Men began dying of old age instead of execution. And that reality unsettled everyone. Aging on death row. San Quentin was never designed for elderly prisoners. Narrow stairs. Hard bunks. Limited medical care. Yet death row grew old together. Walkers replaced workout routines. Medications replaced legal arguments. Conversations turned to aches instead of appeals. Some men joked about becoming ghosts before ever facing execution. Others wondered if dying naturally inside a death row cell was a quiet victory, or the final insult. The moral weight on the system. With executions halted, the system faced an uncomfortable truth. It was maintaining death row at enormous cost, financially, psychologically, morally, without fulfilling its original purpose. Staff continued to train for executions that never came. Facilities remained on standby. Procedures stayed written but unused. Death row existed as a promise the state no longer seemed willing, or able, to keep. And that contradiction weighed heavily on everyone involved. Men who became symbols. Some condemned men became symbols in broader debates, about wrongful convictions, racial bias, mental illness, or excessive punishment. Inside San Quentin, those men were still just inmates, subject to the same routines, the same cells, the same waiting. Fame did not soften the bars. Public attention did not shorten the nights. If anything, it made isolation sharper. What death row teaches about time? Time behaved differently on death row. Days felt endless. Years vanished. Men learned to measure life not by progress, but by endurance. Surviving another year became an achievement. Waking up became an act of resistance. In a place designed to end life, living itself became defiance. The prison that outlived its purpose. San Quentin's death row was built to deliver finality. Instead, it delivered delay. It became a place where punishment lingered without resolution, where death sentences turned into life sentences without parole, without acknowledgement. The prison did not change overnight. It aged slowly, like the men inside it. And as time passed, one question echoed louder than the rest. The question that still remains. San Quentin stands today as a reminder of what happens when certainty collides with hesitation. When punishment is declared but not completed. When justice is promised but postponed. Inside these walls, men waited not just for death, but for meaning. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this. Death row did exactly what it was designed to do. It broke people quietly. Not with spectacle. Not with noise. But with time. When the state got it wrong. Every death row carries a secret fear the system rarely admits out loud. What if the wrong person is here? At San Quentin, that fear was not hypothetical. Over the decades, convictions unraveled. Witnesses recanted. Evidence was discredited. DNA testing emerged and rewrote old assumptions. Some men walked out after decades inside, blinking into a world that had moved on without them. Others were resentenced to life. A few were released entirely. Inside death row, these reversals landed hard. Hope surged, but so did terror. If mistakes were possible, then certainty was a lie. And if certainty was a lie, then anyone could be next. Men began replaying their own trials in their heads, searching for cracks. Was that testimony solid? Was that confession coerced? Did anyone really listen? What followed was not relief. It was dread. The media's shadow. San Quentin existed in two realities. Inside the walls, life was quiet, repetitive, and slow. Outside, it was a symbol, reduced to headlines, soundbites, and mugshots. When executions were scheduled, media attention surged. Reporters gathered outside the gates. Cameras pointed inward, though they could never fully see inside. For the men on death row, this attention felt strange and distant. Their lives were condensed into crimes and court dates, stripped of context, frozen in time. Once the headlines faded, the silence returned. And silence was where death row did its real work. Religion, ritual, and last meaning. Faith took many forms on death row. Some men found religion late, clinging to ritual as a way to anchor themselves. Others rejected it entirely, unwilling to accept forgiveness from a system that would not forgive them. Chaplains walked the tiers quietly, offering conversation more than answers. Sometimes words mattered. Sometimes silence mattered more. For men facing execution, final rituals, last meals, last prayers, last statements, became acts of control in a place where control did not exist. For men who waited indefinitely, rituals served a different purpose. It made time survivable. The death row economy. Even on death row, a small economy formed. Commissary items became currency. Coffee, stamps, and food traded hands through careful negotiation. Money sent from family meant comfort. No money meant dependence. Pride often suffered quietly. Asking for help felt dangerous. Refusing help felt isolating. The system didn't encourage cooperation, but survival did. Silence as a weapon. Perhaps the most powerful force on death row wasn't violence or fear. It was silence. Silence after appeals were denied. Silence after executions. Silence when letters stopped coming. Men learned to sit inside that silence, because resisting it led to breakdown. San Quentin did not shout its punishment. It whispered it, every day, without interruption. When death row became forever. As execution stalled, an unspoken reality settled in. Many men would die here, not by the state's hand, but by age, illness, or despair. Death row quietly transformed into a terminal ward without acknowledgement. No one rewrote the sentence. No one admitted the shift. The men simply aged. And the state looked away. The cost no one counts. The cost of death row was never just financial. It was psychological debt carried by everyone involved. Officers retired early. Medical staff burned out. Lawyers carried cases for decades. Families on all sides lived suspended between past and future. San Quentin absorbed all of it, brick by brick. A system afraid to end it. Ending death row would require a decision. Continuing executions would require another. California chose neither. Instead, it let time decide. But time is not neutral. It punishes without accountability. It erodes without explanation. And on death row, time became the executioner. What remains unresolved? San Quentin still stands. The cells are still there. The men are still waiting. Some believe abolition is inevitable. Others believe executions will return. But inside those walls, belief matters less than reality. Reality is routine. Reality is waiting. Reality is waking up in a cell built for the end of life, and continuing anyway. Final reflection. San Quentin's death row did not just ask whether the state should take a life. It asked whether the state could hold one indefinitely without destroying something in the process. Justice delayed became something else entirely. And long after policies change and debates fade, the echo of that waiting remains, etched into concrete, steel, and memory. The question is no longer what death row was meant to do. The question is whether anyone is willing to decide what it has become. San Quentin's death row was built to deliver finality. Instead, it delivered waiting, years stacked on years, lives suspended between judgment and ending. What happened inside those cells forces a question that doesn't fade with time. When punishment never reaches its conclusion, who is it really meant to serve? The walls are still standing. The sentences are still written. And the silence is still doing its work. Because long after the execution stopped, San Quentin continues to ask America a question it has never fully answered.